Miss Marple and the bride who used her mother's curse. Chapter 1. The wedding that should never have been the morning of Catherine. Ashford's wedding broke grey and uncertain over the village of Marple, as if the sky itself harboured doubts about the union. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the third pew of St. Michael's Church, observed this meteorological hesitation with the same calm attention she brought to everything, the way the bride's mother, Eleanor Ashford, gripped her handbag with white-knuckled intensity, the nervous tick in the groom's left eye, the peculiar absence of Eleanor's husband, whose empty seat beside her spoke volumes to those inclined to listen. Miss Marple was, of course, inclined to listen. At 84, she had spent more than half a century observing the human condition in all its contradictory glory, and she found that villages, like gardens, revealed their secrets to those patient, enough to notice the withered blooms among the flourishing ones. The church was crowded. Millbrook was not a large village, but everyone who was anyone and several who were decidedly no one had turned out for the wedding. Catherine was marrying James Thornton, a solicitor from the neighbouring town of Ashridge, and the match had all the hallmarks of a society wedding. The bride's dress had been imported from London. The flowers, white roses and trailing ivy, had cost more than most families earned in a month, and the reception would be held at Millbrook Manor, the ancestral home of the Ashfords, which had stood on the hill overlooking the village for 3 centuries. Yet despite all this grandeur, there was something distinctly uncomfortable about the proceedings. Miss Marple had noticed it in the way Catherine refused to meet her mother's eyes during the service. She had noted it in the peculiar little smile that played about the lips of James Thornton as he watched his bride walk toward him, not the smile of a man in love, but something more calculating, almost predatory, and she had certainly observed it in the whispered conversations that had filled the village for the past fortnight. Ever since the engagement had been announced with unseemly haste, the vicar, Reverend Blackwell, spoke of love and commitment, his voice carrying the comforting monotony of a man who had performed this same ceremony hundreds of times and trusted the words to do their work. Catherine knelt beside James, her white veil creating a delicate halo around her dark hair. She was 26 years old, pretty in a rather ethereal way, with her mother's pale complexion and delicate features. She had always been rather a serious girl. Miss Marple reflected, not the sort to lose her head over a handsome face, which made her current situation all the more intriguing. The reception began at 2:30, held in the great garden of Millbrook Manor. Long tables had been arranged in the shade of ancient oaks, and servants moved about with trays of champagne and canap. The afternoon had cleared somewhat, and a tentative sun broke through the clouds, as if making a belated apology for its earlier doubt. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the garden, her walking stick in one hand, nursing a glass of excellent sherry. She was wearing her best grey dress, the one with the lavender trim that Jean, her nephew's wife, said gave her a distinguished air. At her age, she found formal occasions rather exhausting, but they were invaluable for observation. People were always more themselves at weddings and funerals, she had found. The ordinary rules of social conduct became somehow slippery. Terrible business, a voice said at her elbow. Miss Marple turned to find Margaret Holloway, the vicar's wife, settling herself onto the chair beside her with a soft sigh. Margaret was the sort of woman who believed she had a duty to share all village gossip with those willing to listen, which is to say, almost everyone. "Have you heard about Eleanor's sister? Eleanor Ashford's sister, I mean." "No, dear," Miss Marple said gently, "but I suspect you're about to tell me." Margaret leaned closer, her eyes bright with the particular excitement that came from dispensing scandal. She passed away 3 months ago. In Italy, quite suddenly, by all accounts. Eleanor hasn't said much about it, but they say there was rather a rift between them. Miss Marple filed this away. The absence of visible mourning at Eleanor's throat, no black armband, no grey. The way her hands trembled slightly when she lifted her glass to her lips. The hard set of her jaw as she watched her daughter with the new husband. These details suddenly acquired new resonance. And the family curse, of course, Margaret continued, lowering her voice still further. Though one mustn't speak of such things at a wedding. But you know Eleanor's reputation in the village. Her mother was supposed to have been rather peculiar, into things that weren't quite natural. If you take my meaning, Miss Marple took her meaning perfectly. She had lived long enough to know that villages were repositories of old superstitions, that the line between genuine belief and useful mythology was often deliberately blurred. She was also experienced enough to know that these old stories frequently concealed hard kernels of truth. I've always found that reputation and reality are two very different things, Miss Marple observed mildly. Perhaps, Margaret said, though her tone suggested she was not entirely convinced. But did you notice that Eleanor didn't give a toast at lunch? The Father Cyril gave one, but Eleanor simply sat there with a glass of water, and she didn't eat a bite of the wedding cake. Very peculiar behavior for a mother on her daughter's wedding day. This was also true, Miss Marple reflected. She had observed Eleanor pushing food about her plate with a fork, leaving it largely untouched. She had noted the way Eleanor's eyes seemed to follow Catherine's every movement, watchful and calculating. And she had certainly noticed that Eleanor had excused herself 3 times during the reception, once to use the ladies' room, once to speak urgently, though inaudibly, to one of the servants, and once to stand alone at the edge of the garden, staring out toward the village as if looking for something or someone. But the most telling detail, the one that would have seemed innocent to almost everyone else, was the glass of sherry that Eleanor had prepared with her own hands and left on a table near where Catherine and James stood receiving congratulations. Catherine had not drunk it. James had not drunk it. It had sat there, untouched, gathering condensation in the afternoon warmth. It was the sort of thing that might mean nothing at all, or it might mean everything. I should pay my respects to the happy couple, Miss Marple said to Margaret, rising with the careful deliberation of age. And perhaps I'll have a word with Eleanor as well. I knew her mother, you know, years ago, before she passed. Margaret's eyes widened with interest. But Miss Marple had already moved away, her pace slow but purposeful, her observant eyes taking in every detail of the scene before her. Catherine's forced smile, James's proprietary hand on her arm, Eleanor's white-knuckled grip on her handbag, and the way the sherry glass still stood untouched, a small monument to something that had not quite come to pass. In the distance, a church bell tolled the half-hour. The sun continued its intermittent appearance and disappearance behind the clouds, as though unable to decide whether this occasion merited its full attention. Miss Marple, however, had decided. Something was very wrong in Milton. She could feel it as surely as she could feel the weight of her walking stick in her hand, the whisper of her skirts, the measured beating of her old heart. And by the end of this wedding day, she was quite certain the wrongness would become a very great deal more obvious indeed. Chapter 2. The scream in the garden. The reception had stretched into early evening, the long English summer light lingering stubbornly above the horizon. Lanterns had been lit throughout the garden, casting a warm glow across the tables where guests lingered over coffee and digestives. The orchestra, modest ensemble of 5 musicians hired from Ashridge, played selections from popular operettas, the sort of music designed to encourage both conversation and sentiment without demanding either full attention. Miss Marple had retired to a quiet bench near the rose garden, her walking stick leaning against the armrest. From this vantage point, she could observe the gathering without appearing to do so. The skill of invisibility, she had long ago discovered, was one of the great advantages of old age. People looked through her rather than at her, which meant she saw far more than she was meant to see. She had watched Eleanor make another surreptitious journey to the ladies' room not 15 minutes ago. Emerging with her composure reassembled, but her eyes distinctly red-rimmed. She had observed James Thornton stepping away from his bride with increasing frequency. Once to telephone someone from the study she knew, because she had seen him slip inside and heard the faint murmur of his voice through the open window, and once to speak in urgent, low tones with a dark-haired woman. Miss Marple did not recognize someone from outside the village, clearly, by the cut of her dress and the metropolitan sophistication of her bearing. Catherine, herself, had become progressively quieter as the afternoon wore on. She had danced the required dances with increasing mechanical precision, smiled with decreasing conviction, and spent the last quarter hour seated alone beneath the gazebo. Her white dress luminous in the gathering dusk, her expression something between resignation and dread. It was at 8:30, as the orchestra was transitioning between pieces, that the scream came. It erupted from the direction of the manor house, a cry so primal and unexpected that it seemed to freeze everyone in place for a moment, as though the sound had briefly stopped time itself. The orchestra stuttered to a halt. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses were set down with deliberate care. Then chaos bloomed. That came from inside, someone said. From upstairs, I think, Eleanor. Another voice suggested, heavy with significance. Eleanor sounded rather distressed at lunch. Within moments, guests were rising from their tables, uncertain whether to move toward the sound or away from it. The house staff, trained in discretion, looked at one another with barely concealed alarm. Miss Marple rose slowly and deliberately, moving toward the manor with the unhurried purpose of someone who had witnessed far too much of life to be startled by mere screams. She found the commotion concentrated in the entrance hall. Several guests had already gathered, creating an anxious knot of confused humanity. The screaming had stopped, replaced by a heavy, ominous silence. James Thornton stood at the foot of the grand staircase, his face pale, his jaw clenched. "Has someone called for the police?" he asked, his voice sharp and commanding. "And fetch Dr. Hartley immediately." It was Eleanor who had screamed, they soon learned. Eleanor had gone upstairs to her bedroom to freshen up poor, so she claimed, when she emerged from her room moments later. Her dress disheveled, her hair coming loose from its careful arrangement. She had found, she said, in a voice that trembled with controlled hysteria, the door to Catherine's old room standing open. Catherine's old room, the one in the east wing that had been locked for the past 3 years. "I merely wondered why it was open," Eleanor explained to the gathering crowd, her hands shaking as she gripped the banister. "I went to look, and then I saw." She could not seem to finish the sentence. It fell to Cyril Ashford, Catherine's father, to go upstairs and determine what his wife had found. He was a man of stolid temperament, not given to dramatic gestures, but even his composure cracked visibly when he emerged from the east wing. He spoke quietly to Reverend Blackwell, who paled beneath his tan dot. The details emerged with the slow, awful precision of a photograph developing in chemical baths. There was a body in Catherine's old room. A woman's body. She appeared to have been there for some time, weeks, possibly longer. The body was partially concealed beneath an old dust sheet, but there was no ambiguity about the fact of death. Miss Marple, standing quietly to one side, watched the reactions of those around her with her characteristic attention to the small, telling details. She observed the way James Thornton's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket before catching himself. She noted the expression of something almost like relief that flickered across Eleanor's face before she caught herself and replaced it with horror. She saw Catherine appear at the top of the stairs, still in her wedding dress, and watched as her eyes moved from her mother to her new husband to the gathered guests below, taking in the situation with an almost preternatural calm. "There are police arriving," someone announced. "I can hear the motor cars." The village constable, Sergeant Davies, appeared within 10 minutes, followed shortly by Inspector Thornbury from the county police. Both men had the weary competence of professionals confronted with a situation that would require considerable untangling. They established a perimeter, politely but firmly ushering guests toward the drawing room, and ascended the stairs with the methodical purpose of those accustomed to death. It would be an hour before the body was officially identified, though Miss Marple had made the identification herself the moment she heard Eleanor's description, and had been perfectly unsurprised by what the official announcement confirmed. The body in Catherine's old room was that of Margaret Ashford, Eleanor's sister. Margaret, who was supposed to be in Italy, living quietly abroad. Margaret, who had passed away 3 months ago. According to the village gossip, Margaret, who was now proving to be very dead indeed, though considerably closer to home than anyone had been led to believe. As the constables established their investigation and guests were herded toward eventual interviews, Miss Marple slipped quietly into the drawing room and took a seat near the window. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky, and the lanterns that had seemed so festive hours earlier now cast peculiar, elongated shadows across the garden. No one appeared to notice her there. They were all too occupied with the shock of discovery, the thrill of proximity to scandal, the delicious horror of finding murder for murder. It must surely be in their very midst. Miss Marple, however, was thinking about Catherine's expression as she stood at the top of the stairs. She was thinking about Eleanor's moment of relief. She was thinking about the untouched sherry glass, about the locked room, about the sister in Italy who was not in Italy at all. She was thinking, in fact, about curses, both the kind that came from ancient folklore and the kind that came from living, breathing human beings with motive and opportunity and the terrible capacity to act upon their darkest impulses. The wedding day, it seemed, had merely been the beginning. Chapter 3. Whispers and Half-Truths. B. The following morning. The news had spread through Millbrook and Thames with the efficiency of wildfire through dry grass. The body in Catherine's locked room had become, by turns, a suicide, a tragic accident, a calculated murder, and most sensationally evidence of an ancient family curse finally coming to its inevitable conclusion. Miss Marple sat in the morning room of her cottage, the Laurels, with a pot of excellent Darjeeling tea and the village's weekly newspaper spread before her. The Millbrook Gazette had managed to secure a statement from Constable Davies confirming only the barest facts. A body had been discovered. The death was being treated as suspicious, and an investigation was underway. The newspaper's own editorial speculations however, filled 3 additional columns with increasingly imaginative theories. A knock at her door announced the arrival of Dolores Finch, the village's most relentless gossip and, paradoxically, one of Miss Marple's most reliable sources of information. Dolores was a woman of 60-odd years who had never married, and who had consequently devoted her considerable energies to the collective affairs of everyone else. She arrived with a Victoria sponge, cake clearly a peace offering or a bri band, an expression suggesting she was bursting with secrets. "You've heard?" "Of course," Dolores said, settling herself into the comfortable chair with the ease of long familiarity. "About the body being Margaret Ashford, Eleanor's sister." "The newspaper was reasonably clear on that point," Miss Marple replied, pouring a second cup of tea. "Though I confess the circumstances remain somewhat unclear." "Well, that's precisely the puzzle," Dolores said, leaning forward with barely suppressed excitement. "You see, Margaret supposedly went to Italy 3 years ago. Not 3 months, 3 years. She left quite suddenly, under rather mysterious circumstances, if you believe half of what people say. And now she turns up dead in Catherine's old bedroom, which has been locked since before Margaret left." This detail was new and significant. Miss Marple filed it away with her characteristic mental precision. 3 years. "Are you quite certain?" "Absolutely certain. I remember it clearly because it was around the time the Hendersons installed their new conservatory. And you know that was 3 years ago, last April. Margaret left in May. Nobody's seen her since. Eleanor received letters from her, postcards from Venice, from Florence, from Positano. All very romantic and Italian. But now it seems Margaret never left England at all." "How extraordinary," Miss Marple murmured. "What was the reason for Margaret's departure? Do you recall?" Dolores's expression took on a delicious significance. There was some sort of falling out with Eleanor. Nobody knows exactly what about the Ashfords keep their private matters rather private, if you understand me. But there was gossip about Margaret having made some unfortunate romantic attachment, a scandal of some sort. Eleanor was apparently quite furious with her. Some people said it had to do with a man, but others suggested it was something more serious, such as, well, there were the stories about Eleanor's mother. You know, Eleanor's family has always had rather a reputation in the village. Her mother, Constance, that was her name. Constance Blackwood, before she married, she was said to be quite involved in spiritualism and the occult. People whispered about curses and hexes and all manner of nonsensical things. Personally, I think it's all fabrication, but villagers do love their mysteries, don't they? Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. And Margaret, what sort of person was she? Rather different from Eleanor, actually. More vivacious. More inclined toward independence and modern thinking. But they were very close as girls, or so I'm told. Something happened between them, though something that drove a wedge. Margaret was always rather fond of Catherine, I remember. Used to spend time with her before she left. But after Margaret departed for Italy, Eleanor seemed quite determined that Catherine shouldn't hear from her. All the letters were apparently opened by Eleanor before being given to Catherine, and after a while they stopped coming altogether. This detail crystallized something in Miss Marple's mind. The locked room. Catherine's room. Margaret had been found there. The implications were beginning to suggest themselves, though Miss Marple was far too experienced to leap to conclusions. "I understand the police are conducting interviews," Miss Marple observed. "Has anyone in the village been questioned?" "Not yet," Dolores said, "but Constable Davies has been making rather pointed visits." He was at the Thorntons' house yesterday, James's family. I mean, not Catherine and her new husband. Apparently, there's some question about the timing of when Margaret actually died. Inspector Thornbury brought in a doctor from the county, and they're trying to determine how long the body had been in that room. A considerable period, I should imagine, Miss Marple said. Given what you described about the condition of the body, weeks at least, Dolores confirmed with unseemly enthusiasm. Perhaps months. The dust sheet had been there quite a while, from what I understand, which raises the obvious question, who put her there? And more importantly, why? The door chimes sounded again, interrupting their conversation. Miss Marple's elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Hartley, admitted Reverend Blackwell, the vicar, looking considerably more troubled than he had during yesterday's wedding ceremony. Miss Marple, he said, nodding to her with evident relief, as though he had been searching specifically for her presence. And Miss Finch, I hope I'm not intruding. Not at all, Vicar, Miss Marple assured him. Please, do sit. Would you care for tea? Reverend Blackwell accepted gratefully and settled himself with the air of a man preparing to unburden himself of considerable information. I've come because I felt you should know something before the police inevitably discover it. I've just come from speaking with Eleanor Ashford. She's in a dreadful state, as you might imagine, but she told me something rather important. He paused, gathering his thoughts with clerical precision. Margaret didn't leave for Italy voluntarily. Eleanor and she had a terrible row. Eleanor has finally admitted as much. The cause was, well, the cause was James Thornton. The name hung in the air like a discordant note. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. James Thornton, she repeated. The groom, Catherine's new husband. The very same, Reverend Blackwell confirmed gravely. Apparently, before he became entangled with Catherine, James was involved with Margaret. Quite seriously involved, it seems. There were rumors of an engagement between them, though nothing was made official. Eleanor disapproved strongly. James was considered unsuitable for various reasons. Eleanor demanded that Margaret end the relationship. When Margaret refused, Eleanor gave her an ultimatum: break with James immediately, or leave the house and the family entirely, and Margaret chose to leave. Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. So Eleanor claimed, Reverend Blackwell said heavily. Eleanor said that Margaret packed a bag and left in considerable anger. Eleanor heard her leave that evening, heard the door slam. She assumed Margaret had gone off to spite her, to live abroad as she had threatened to do. But now, he did not need to finish the sentence. Now it appeared that Margaret had never left at all. Margaret had been locked in Catherine's room, mere yards from where her sister slept, for 3 years. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her aged eyes distant and thoughtful. Outside, the morning sun painted the garden in shades of green and gold, quite innocent of the darkness that had begun to unfold within the walls of Millbrook Manor. How very peculiar, she said softly. And Catherine? Does Catherine know about this attachment between her aunt and her new husband? Neither Dolores nor the Reverend could answer that question, but both looked distinctly troubled by its implications. Chapter 4. The obvious culprit. Inspector Thornbury was a lean, efficient man in his mid-50s, with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much of human nature to retain any illusions about it. By Wednesday morning, 2 days after the discovery, he had conducted preliminary interviews with the principal parties and had apparently reached a conclusion that seemed too many in the village. Startlingly straightforward, Eleanor Ashford was, In his estimation, the most likely suspect, the logic was difficult to argue with, at least on the surface. Eleanor had motive. Margaret's romantic involvement with James Thornton had created a rift between the sisters. Eleanor had opportunity. She was the one who lived in the house, who had access to the locked room, who could have moved Margaret's body without exciting comment. And Eleanor had demonstrated consciousness of guilt through her behavior. Her refusal to eat, her apparent relief when the body was discovered. Most damning of all, Eleanor had lied about Margaret's departure. The letters from Italy, when examined by the police, were discovered to be in Eleanor's own handwriting, carefully disguised and mailed from various post boxes in London. But undeniably Eleanor's work. She had created an elaborate fiction to explain her sister's absence, maintained it for 3 years, and presumably hoped the story would remain undisturbed indefinitely. When confronted with this evidence, Eleanor had confessed to the deception but maintained steadfastly that she had not killed Margaret. Her story, now reluctantly revealed, was that Margaret had indeed left the house on the day of their quarrel. She had slammed the door and departed in anger. Eleanor, furious and hurt, had decided to maintain the fiction of Margaret's voluntary departure. When letters began arriving from Margaret, genuine letters from Margaret, Eleanor now insisted she had panicked and forged responses. Not wishing to admit that Margaret had run away or was in hiding, but Margaret, Eleanor claimed, had stopped writing after approximately 6 months. Eleanor had not known what had happened to her sister. She had not even known Margaret was dead, much less that she was lying in Catherine's old room. A convenient story, Inspector Thornbury observed to Miss Marple during his visit to the Laurels on Wednesday afternoon. He had requested her company specifically, understanding from the village constable that Miss Marple possessed both observational acuity and discretion in equal measure. A woman maintains a 3-year deception about her sister's whereabouts, and when confronted with the body, she claims ignorance of how it arrived there. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed mildly. It does seem suspicious. And yet, the inspector prompted, settling himself with the air of a man accustomed to having his assumptions challenged. And yet, Inspector, if Eleanor had murdered her sister, would she truly have maintained such an elaborate deception about Margaret's location? If Margaret was already deceased in the locked room, the letters seem to serve no purpose whatsoever. They actually draw attention to the question of where Margaret was and what she was doing. A woman intent on concealing a murder would surely be more likely to simply report her sister missing and allow suspicion to fall elsewhere. Inspector Thornbury considered this with the frown of a man encountering an inconvenient contradiction. You suggest Eleanor did not kill her sister? I suggest, Miss Marple said carefully, that the question of who killed Margaret and the question of why Eleanor lied about Margaret's departure may be 2 entirely separate mysteries. Eleanor's deception, while certainly requiring explanation, does not necessarily implicate her in murder. Then who, in your estimation, killed Margaret Ashford? Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the village beyond. That, I suspect, depends very much on answering several prior questions. When did Margaret actually die? Was she killed in that room, or was she placed there after death? And most importantly, who had knowledge that Margaret was in that room, and when did they acquire that knowledge? The inspector remained silent, allowing Miss Marple to continue her train of thought. You see, Miss Marple said, turning back to face him, if Eleanor locked Margaret away on the day of their quarrel, we must ask ourselves why she would do so. Imprisonment is a different crime from murder, Inspector. It suggests a moment of passion, an impulse, rather than premeditation. But Eleanor's subsequent behavior, maintaining the fiction of letters, continuing the deception for 3 years, suggests considerably more calculation. A woman of passionate impulse does not maintain a 3-year lie so meticulously. You're suggesting premeditation, then? I'm suggesting, Miss Marple said, resuming her seat, that we should be very careful about assuming Eleanor's guilt merely because her behavior has been deceptive. In my experience, Inspector, people lie for many reasons, and guilt is only one of them. Fear, shame, protection of others, protection of oneself from judgment, these can all drive deception quite as powerfully as criminal intent. Inspector Thornbury sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. You've given me much to consider, Miss Marple, but you must understand my position. The evidence against Eleanor is substantial. She had motive, opportunity, and she has demonstrably lied about critical facts. I understand perfectly, Miss Marple assured him, and I do not dispute that Eleanor's behavior requires investigation. But I would urge caution against reaching conclusions prematurely. There are several other individuals whose movements and relationships bear scrutiny as well, such as James Thornton, Miss Marple said quietly. The groom. He was romantically involved with Margaret prior to his attachment to Catherine. He had clear reasons to wish Margaret out of the way her continued existence, and her history with him could hardly have been pleasing to Catherine. Moreover, he appears to have maintained connections with someone in the village, the dark-haired woman I observed him speaking with at the reception. Who is she, Inspector? And why did he feel compelled to telephone her from the manor house on the very day of his wedding? You've been making your own observations, the inspector said, a note of amusement entering his voice. I observe what is evident to anyone willing to pay attention, Miss Marple replied. And what appears evident to me is that James Thornton may well have secrets worth keeping. Secrets that might extend to Margaret's death. We've questioned him, Thornbury said. He maintains that his previous relationship with Margaret was a youthful entanglement, now entirely in the past. He claims he had no idea Margaret was even in England, much less dead in Catherine's bedroom. What did Catherine say? The inspector's expression shifted slightly. Miss Catherine has been remarkably composed through all of this. She claims she knew nothing of her aunt's presence in the locked room. She did not know about the previous relationship between her aunt and her new husband until after the body was discovered. She has been cooperative and forthcoming in all her statements. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, a gesture that suggested she found Catherine's composure as worthy of note as Eleanor's anxiety. How very interesting. Most young women would be considerably more distressed to discover a corpse in their childhood home, not to mention the revelation of their husband's previous romantic entanglement with the deceased. You suggest Catherine is I suggest nothing of the sort, Miss Marple said gently. I merely note that different temperaments respond differently to shock. Some scream and weep. Others retreat into a kind of protective numbness. Which sort of person is Catherine, do you think? Inspector Thornbury rose to leave, clearly unsettled by the direction of their conversation. You paint a considerably more complex picture than I had anticipated, Miss Marple. I shall keep your observations in mind. After he had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her morning room, watching the afternoon light slant across her garden. She was thinking about Catherine standing at the top of the stairs in her white wedding dress, her expression serene and unsurprised. She was thinking about Eleanor's relief, quickly hidden. She was thinking about James Thornton's predatory smile, and she was thinking, most of all, about the untouched sherry glass that Eleanor had prepared with her own hands, and about the question of who it had been intended for, and whether that intended victim had escaped it, or been spared from its consumption by some other intervention entirely. The obvious culprit, Miss Marple reflected, was often the least likely to be guilty. But occasionally, the obvious culprit was obvious for very good reasons indeed. Chapter 5. The overlooked detail. It was Thursday morning when Miss Marple, while reviewing the newspaper accounts of the case in her comfortable sitting room, noticed something that would prove to be the thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire carefully constructed web of deception. The article, written by a rather breathless journalist from the county paper, described the discovery of Margaret's body in meticulous detail. The locked room, the dust sheet, the state of decomposition, and then, almost in passing, a single sentence that caught Miss Marple's attention. According to the medical examination conducted by Dr. Morrison, the deceased had been deceased for approximately 6 months, though the precise timing remains somewhat uncertain due to the conditions of preservation. 6 months. Miss Marple set down the newspaper with deliberate care and reached for her writing pad. She began to compile a timeline, working methodically from the facts as they had been established. Margaret had supposedly left the house 3 years ago. In May, Eleanor had forged letters from Margaret for 6 months, after which the letters had ceased. This would place the end of the correspondence at approximately November of that first year, if Margaret had been dead for 6 months, as of now early July. That placed her death at approximately January of the current year, just 6 months ago. But Eleanor's false letters had continued for only 6 months after Margaret's departure. This meant that Margaret could not have died on the day of her quarrel with Eleanor, as the police seemed to assume. Margaret must have been alive for considerably longer. In fact, Margaret must have been alive for considerably longer than Eleanor's letter-forging scheme had continued. Miss Marple rose and walked to her telephone, a device she found rather tiresome but necessary. She rang the local constable's office and requested that Constable Davies call upon her at his earliest convenience. Within the hour, the constable, good-natured man of 40-odd years, appeared at her door. "I believe there may be a discrepancy in the timeline that the inspector should examine," Miss Marple said without preamble. Once she had settled Davies with tea, she showed him the newspaper article and her own calculations, explained the mathematical impossibility of Margaret having died on the day of her quarrel with Eleanor. Given the timeline of Eleanor's letter forging, Davies's face grew increasingly troubled as he followed her reasoning. "You're suggesting that Margaret was alive for some time after Eleanor claims she left the house." "I'm suggesting that the dates provided by the medical examination and the dates of Eleanor's letters create a logical inconsistency," Miss Marple said carefully. "Someone is mistaken about the timing. Either Dr. Morrison's estimate of the time of death is inaccurate, or Eleanor's account of when Margaret's correspondence ceased is inaccurate, or both." By Friday afternoon, Inspector Thornbury had returned to the Laurels, this time with considerably less certainty in his demeanor. He brought with him a folder containing Eleanor's letters, all of them, retrieved from Margaret's supposed Italian correspondence. "You were quite right," he said grimly. "The final letter from Margaret is dated November 15th of 3 years ago. But according to Dr. Morrison's refined examination, Margaret could not have been dead when that letter was written. In fact, Dr. Morrison now believes Margaret was alive as recently as January of this year. 2 years and 2 months, Miss Marple said softly. between the cessation of Eleanor's false letters and Margaret's death. What happened to Margaret during that time? That is precisely the question, Thornbury said heavily. If Margaret did not leave the house on the day of her quarrel with Eleanor, then where was she? Who was keeping her? And why did Eleanor's letter-forging cease? Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested, Eleanor ran out of things to write about. Or perhaps she realized that continuing the fiction had become more dangerous than abandoning it. Or perhaps, and this seems to me most likely, someone discovered the truth about what Eleanor had been doing, and Margaret was moved, or the fiction was abandoned for some other reason entirely. The inspector paced her sitting room with evident frustration. If Eleanor didn't kill Margaret, then she was complicit in her imprisonment for some portion of the time Margaret was alive. That alone is a serious crime. It is, Miss Marple agreed. Though we must be careful not to assume Eleanor knew precisely where Margaret was or what condition she was in. Complicity, as you say, does not necessarily extend to knowledge of murder. Then, who killed her? Thornbury demanded. If Eleanor didn't, if the death occurred only recently, who had access to Margaret and motive to kill her? Miss Marple was silent for a moment, her aged fingers folded in her lap. That is the question that now requires investigation, Inspector. And I believe the answer may lie not in Margaret's past, but in Catherine's future. Catherine's future. The wedding, Miss Marple said. Catherine married James Thornton 3 days before Margaret's body was discovered. A wedding that, by all accounts, was arranged rather hastily. A wedding that came to fruition just as Margaret, who had been missing or hidden for 3 years, suddenly appeared. Does this not strike you as a remarkable coincidence? Inspector Thornbury's expression suggested it did indeed. You're suggesting the wedding and Margaret's death are connected. I'm suggesting that the timing is worthy of very careful examination, Miss Marple replied. Tell me, Inspector, when was the engagement between Catherine and James announced? Approximately 2 weeks before the wedding. 2 weeks. Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. That is extraordinarily hasty. Did anyone question this precipitous arrangement? According to the statements I've taken, James insisted on the rapid timeline. He told Catherine he could not bear to wait any longer to make her his wife. It was presented as a romantic gesture, passionate and eager. How very convenient, Miss Marple murmured. And during those 2 weeks, was Margaret's presence in the locked room discovered? Had anyone attempted to open that door? Thornbury shook his head. Not that we've been able to determine. The door appears to have been secured from the outside. No one would have had reason to open it unless they had knowledge that someone was inside. And yet, Miss Marple said thoughtfully, someone did open that door eventually. Someone discovered Margaret's body. That someone was Eleanor. My question is, what prompted Eleanor to open that particular door on that particular day? She had apparently refrained from opening it for 3 years. Why, suddenly, on the day of Catherine's wedding, did she feel compelled to investigate? This question hung between them, unanswered and increasingly troubling. I shall make further inquiries, Inspector Thornbury said finally. There are aspects of James Thornton's movements and financial circumstances that merit closer examination, and Catherine's knowledge of events may be more extensive than she has thus far admitted. After he had left, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room as the afternoon light began to fade. She was thinking about the nature of marriages that were arranged in haste. She was thinking about men who could smile predatorily while claiming love. She was thinking about young women who remained composed in the face of terrible discoveries, and she was thinking about curses both the kind whispered about in villages, and the kind that might be deliberately constructed by those clever enough and determined enough to use superstition as a weapon. Catherine's wedding had not solved James's problem, Miss Marple reflected. It had merely begun to compound it, because Margaret, dead or alive, imprisoned or free, had been a danger to him, and Catherine, by marrying him, had walked directly into that danger without seemingly understanding the peril she faced. Unless, of course, Catherine understood precisely what she was doing and why. It was a possibility that Miss Marple found increasingly worthy of serious consideration. Chapter 6. The Woman in the Shadows. By Saturday morning, the village of Millbrook-on-Thames was alive with a new and more sophisticated species of gossip. The theory that Eleanor had murdered her sister in a fit of rage had given way to whispered speculation about James Thornton, about his financial circumstances, about the mysterious woman he had been seen with. On multiple occasions prior to the wedding, Inspector Thornbury had moved with commendable efficiency. He had traced the woman. Her name was Victoria Marsh, a woman of 32 who lived in a modest flat in Ashridge, and who had, until quite recently, been employed as a secretary at the law firm where James Thornton worked. The inspector's discreet inquiries revealed that Victoria and James had conducted what appeared to be a romantic relationship for approximately 2 years, a relationship that had allegedly ended when James's engagement to Catherine had been announced. Miss Marple learned these details not from the inspector, who maintained professional discretion, but from her network of village informants. By Saturday afternoon, she had received visits from Margaret Holloway, the vicar's wife, Dolores Finch, the relentless gossip, and Mrs. Henderson, the postmistress, each bringing variations on the same essential story. James had been keeping a woman in Ashridge while courting Catherine, and only the announcement of the engagement had forced an end to that arrangement. What made this information particularly intriguing was what it suggested about motivation. James had been financially dependent upon his legal practice, which was respectable but not lucrative. Catherine, by contrast, came from considerable wealth. The Ashford family had money, property, and social standing. A marriage to Catherine would have elevated James's circumstances substantially, but Victoria Marsh, the inspector's inquiries had revealed, had been pressing James for marriage. She had grown tired of being a secret, tired of waiting for James to commit to her. There had been quarrels, ultimatums, tears, and then, quite suddenly, James had announced his engagement to Catherine Ashford and ended his relationship with Victoria entirely. The question, Miss Marple observed to Constable Davies during a visit on Saturday evening, is whether Victoria Marsh had any connection to Margaret Ashford's death, or whether she simply represents a motive that James Thornton might have had for committing it. One is a question of conspiracy, the other merely of passion and financial desperation. The inspector is interviewing Miss Marsh again tomorrow, Davies said. He hopes to establish whether she had any knowledge of Margaret or any reason to wish her harm. And what of Catherine? Miss Marple asked. Has the inspector pressed her regarding what she knew and when she knew it? Davies hesitated, clearly uncertain whether he should share information about an ongoing investigation with a civilian, even one as evidently trustworthy as Miss Marple. Miss Catherine has maintained that she knew nothing of her husband's previous relationship with her aunt until after the body was discovered. She claims the engagement and marriage were conducted entirely at her new husband's insistence, and that she was delighted to comply. How very convenient, Miss Marple murmured. And her knowledge of the locked room, Has anyone questioned whether she knew Margaret was imprisoned there? She claims complete ignorance. The locked room was locked before she was old enough to remember, and she was told it contained her mother's personal items that Eleanor wished to keep private. Catherine says she never questioned the door or attempted to open it. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the village bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. There is something troubling me, Constable. If James wished to murder Margaretha, to eliminate her as a romantic obstacle or as some other threat, why did he not do so earlier? Why did he wait until the timing of Catherine's wedding coincided so precisely with the discovery of the body? Surely, if he was capable of imprisoning and killing a woman, he might have done so at any point during the past 3 years. The inspector believes James may not have known where Margaret was, Davies said carefully. That Eleanor may have hidden her deliberately, and James only discovered the truth recently, perhaps because of the wedding preparations disturbing the house, or because Eleanor finally confessed. But Eleanor claims she did not kill Margaret, Miss Marple noted, and our timeline suggests Margaret could not have been imprisoned by Eleanor alone if she was alive for 2 years after Eleanor's correspondence ceased. So who was keeping Margaret during that time? Who had the knowledge, the access, and the motive to do so? The questions hung unanswered between them. On Sunday morning, after church services, Miss Marple encountered Catherine Thornton at the village shop. The young woman was purchasing flowers, pale pink roses, with an air of determined normalcy. She was dressed impeccably, her hair perfectly arranged, her composure as serene as it had been on her wedding day. To any casual observer, Catherine appeared to be a young bride going about her ordinary business without concern. But Miss Marple had learned long ago to look beneath surfaces. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple said gently, placing a hand on Catherine's arm. "How are you managing through this dreadful business?" Catherine turned, and for just an instant, the merest fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Not shock, not surprise, but a kind of recognition, as though she had been expecting this encounter. "As well as one might, Miss Marple. It is all quite overwhelming, I confess. To discover that my aunt had been dead all this time, hidden away in our own home. It is almost incomprehensible." "It must be," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, dear, when did your husband first tell you about his previous attachment to Margaret? Was it before the engagement, or only after the discovery of her body?" Catherine's composure remained intact, but her fingers tightened slightly on the bouquet of roses. "After, of course. I knew nothing of it before. James said he was protecting my feelings by not mentioning his past indiscretions." "How thoughtful of him," Miss Marple said mildly. "And your mother? Did she seem surprised when you told her about this previous attachment?" "My mother was far too distressed about Margaret's death to concern herself with ancient history," Catherine replied, but there was something in her tone that suggested careful calculation. She was, Miss Marple realized, measuring her responses, considering each answer before providing it. "Your mother has been remarkably protective of you throughout this affair," Miss Marple continued, "almost as though she were protecting you from something specific. Do you have any sense of what that might be?" For a moment, Catherine's perfect composure seemed to waver. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and in that brief contact, an entire conversation appeared to pass between them, not in words, but in the language of understanding. Catherine looked away first, her voice dropping slightly. "My mother is a woman of strong principles, Miss Marple. She has always believed that protecting one's family, whatever the cost, is paramount. That duty supersedes many other considerations." "I see," Miss Marple said softly. "And do you share those principles, dear? Do you also believe that family loyalty should supersede truth?" "I believe," Catherine said carefully, "that some truths are more complicated than they appear, and that sometimes understanding someone's motives requires understanding their circumstances. Circumstances can lead people to do things they might otherwise never contemplate." It was, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkably sophisticated answer for a young woman supposedly unaware of the depth of intrigue swirling around her. It was the answer of someone who understood perfectly well what had happened, who understood the motivations of those involved, and who had made a deliberate choice about which side of the truth to occupy. "Thank you for that candor," Miss Marple said. "I suspect it will prove very helpful indeed." As she watched Catherine leave the shop, clutching her pale pink roses, Miss Marple found herself reconsidering everything she thought she knew about the young bride. Catherine's composure, her serenity, her seemingly innocent acceptance of her hasty marriage, all of it now appeared in a very different light. The question was no longer simply who had killed Margaret Ashford. The question had become far more complex. What had Catherine known? What had she chosen to do about it? And was she complicit in her aunt's death, or merely in its concealment? Chapter 7, Another Twist. It was Wednesday morning when Inspector Thornbury arrived at the Laurels, with news that fundamentally altered the trajectory of the investigation. He looked, Miss Marple observed, considerably less certain than he had appeared in previous visits, which suggested that certainty itself had become a luxury he could no longer afford. "We've discovered something rather significant," he said, settling himself with evident weariness. "Something that calls into question much of what we've assumed about James Thornton's involvement." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Do tell." "The locked room," Thornbury began, "was locked from the outside with a key kept in Eleanor's bedroom. That much we established early on. But we've now discovered that the room was not locked continuously over the past 3 years. There are marks on the lock mechanism suggesting it has been opened and reclosed multiple times, at intervals. Moreover, we found something else. A small opening in the wall between Catherine's old room and the adjoining guest room, concealed behind a loose panel." Miss Marple felt a small thrill of recognition. This was the sort of detail that rewrote entire narratives. A passage. More precisely, a way to pass items between rooms without opening the main door. Food, water, perhaps other necessities. The guest room has been unoccupied for some time, but a careful examination revealed evidence that it was accessed regularly. Dust patterns on the floor, worn paths between the wall panel and the door. And this discovery suggests what, precisely? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew. It suggests that Margaret was not simply imprisoned and forgotten. Someone was actively maintaining her, bringing her food, water, perhaps medicine. Someone was keeping her alive, deliberately. Someone with regular access to both rooms and knowledge of the passage's existence. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, allowing the implications of this revelation to settle over her like dust. A prisoner deliberately maintained. A secret passage for bringing necessities. Regular access over months or years. "Eleanor," she said softly. "It would appear so," Thornbury agreed. "But here's where matters become complicated. We questioned Eleanor about the passage, about the maintenance of the prisoner, about why she would keep her sister alive, rather than simply disposing of her body immediately. Her answer was unexpected. She claimed she did not know Margaret was being kept alive." "Precisely. Eleanor swears that she locked the door after Margaret's supposed departure." never opened it again, and had no knowledge that anyone was inside. She claims the passage was constructed decades ago. By her father, there are records suggesting this is true and that she believed it had been sealed. She had no idea it was still accessible. Miss Marple turned from the window to face the inspector directly. Then who was maintaining Margaret? Who had knowledge of the passage, access to both rooms, and reason to keep her alive? Thornbury's expression was grim. That is the question that now occupies the bulk of my investigation, and the answer, I'm afraid, is increasingly difficult to ignore. Over the following days, as Thornbury conducted his renewed inquiries, new evidence emerged that painted a vastly different picture of the crime. A servant, one of the older members of the Ashford household, staff admitted, under careful questioning, that she had been instructed by someone to leave food outside the guest room on certain evenings. She had been paid handsomely for her discretion and had been told that the arrangement was a family matter that required confidentiality. The servant could not identify who had given her these instructions. The payments had been made in cash, left in an envelope with her wages. But the handwriting on the envelope, when examined by a handwriting expert brought in from the county, bore a striking resemblance to the handwriting of Cyril Ashford, Catherine's father. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. Cyril Ashford, the quiet, composed patriarch of the family, suddenly became a person of intense interest. Where had he been the day Margaret disappeared? What were his financial circumstances? What possible motive could he have had for keeping his sister-in-law imprisoned in his own home? The answers, when they emerged, were troubling in their complexity. Cyril Ashford, it transpired, had been involved in a financial scandal some 8 years previously. Margaret, at that time, had been his accountant, a detail that had somehow escaped notice in the earlier phases of the investigation. Margaret had discovered discrepancies in Cyril's accounts, evidence that he had been embezzling from the family business. She had threatened to report him to the authorities unless he made immediate restitution. The row between Eleanor and Margaret had not, in fact, been about Margaret's romance with James Thornton at all. It had been about this discovery. Eleanor had defended her husband fiercely, had accused Margaret of betrayal, had demanded that Margaret keep silent. When Margaret had refused, Eleanor had given her the ultimatum: leave the house, or the family would be destroyed. But Margaret had not actually left. At some point, the exact timing remained unclear. She had been intercepted by Cyril. Whether she had agreed to silence in exchange for her freedom, or whether she had been forcibly detained, remained a matter of speculation. But what was now evident was that Cyril had kept her prisoner in the locked room, maintained her secretly through the servant, and had continued this arrangement for years. The question becomes, Miss Marple observed to Inspector Thornbury during his latest visit, whether Margaret's imprisonment was punitive confinement or protective detention, whether she was kept alive because Cyril had some reason to believe she might eventually forgive him, or whether he was simply too terrified of her knowledge to release her or eliminate her. We're attempting to determine the precise nature of their arrangement, Thornbury said. But Cyril maintains complete silence on the matter. He won't speak to anyone. His solicitor has advised him to say nothing until he understands what charges might be levied against him. And how did Margaret die? Miss Marple asked. Has Dr. Morrison revised his assessment? Not substantially. The cause of death was poisoning, rather sophisticated mixture of compounds that would have caused internal hemorrhaging. The poison was administered through food or drink approximately 6 months ago. Whether it was administered with Margaret's knowledge, whether it might even be considered assisted suicide, or whether it was murder, we cannot yet determine. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. She was thinking about the untouched sherry glass that Eleanor had prepared on Catherine's wedding day. She was thinking about Catherine's composed face at the top of the stairs. She was thinking about the careful answer Catherine had given her about family loyalty and circumstances. There is still something missing from this narrative, Miss Marple said finally. Something that doesn't quite fit. Tell me, Inspector, when did James Thornton first become involved in Catherine's life? How long had he been courting her before the engagement was announced? Thornbury consulted his notebook. According to Catherine's statement, approximately 3 months. They met at a social function in Ashridge, and he pursued her quite deliberately and rapidly. The engagement announcement came quite suddenly, but Catherine claimed to be delighted. 3 months, Miss Marple repeated, and the engagement was announced approximately 2 weeks before the wedding, which means the decision to marry was made very quickly indeed. Tell me, did anyone in the family object to the match? Did Cyril or Eleanor express reservations about James? Not according to the statements we've taken. Both parents appeared to accept the engagement without particular objection, though Eleanor seemed somewhat anxious. Anxious, Miss Marple echoed. Yes, I imagine she would have been. Can you tell me what Cyril's reaction was to the news of the engagement? The inspector frowned, consulting his notes again. He seemed relieved, actually. According to the household staff, he appeared quite pleased when Catherine told him she was to be married. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, assembling the pieces of a puzzle that seemed to be forming a very different picture than the one the official investigation had been constructing. Inspector, I believe you should examine very carefully whether James Thornton's interest in Catherine was genuine, or whether it was prompted by someone. Whether, in fact, the entire engagement might have been engineered by a member of the Ashford family for purposes that have nothing whatever to do with romance. Thornbury's eyes widened as the implications of this suggestion settled upon him. You believe Catherine was married off deliberately? That someone in her family arranged the match for strategic reasons? I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that Catherine's marriage coincided very precisely with Margaret's death. I believe that James's hasty timeline, his rapid pursuit of Catherine, and his apparent indifference to his previous attachment to Margaret might all suggest that he was manipulated into this arrangement by someone with particular knowledge and particular goals. And I believe that when you examine the precise timing and circumstances, you may discover that Margaret did not die despite the marriage. Margaret died because of the marriage. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's careful game Thursday afternoon found Miss Marple sitting in the drawing room of Millbrook Manor, a guest ostensibly of Eleanor Ashford. The invitation had come somewhat unexpectedly, a quiet request that Miss Marple call upon her, that she wished to speak with someone whose judgment she trusted, and whose discretion was beyond question. Eleanor received her in a state of barely contained distress. She had aged considerably in the week since Margaret's body had been discovered, her face drawn and grey, her movements mechanical and weary. She offered Miss Marple tea, which they both took in silence for several minutes before Eleanor finally spoke. They believe Cyril kept Margaret alive all these years, Eleanor said, her voice hollow. That he imprisoned her deliberately, that he poisoned her 6 months ago. Miss Marple, I don't know what to believe anymore. My husband, who I thought I knew, appears to be a stranger entirely. And Catherine, my poor, dear Catherine, she married a man because of some scheme I don't fully understand. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully before responding. Tell me, Eleanor, when did you discover that Margaret was still alive? Not when did you know she was dead, but when did you realize she had never actually left the house? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set down her cup. I'm not entirely certain. It was a gradual thing, I think. Cyril had told me she left that night. He said she had packed a bag and gone. But then, when I found her in the locked room, I suddenly realized that I had never actually seen her leave. I had only heard him tell me she had left. And then I began to remember other things, peculiar sounds from that wing of the house. Cyril's insistence that certain areas remain undisturbed. His anger if anyone came near the guest room. But you did nothing, Miss Marple said gently. You did not report her absence to the authorities. You did not attempt to discover her location. You forged letters from her for 6 months. I was protecting Cyril, Eleanor whispered. He explained that Margaret had discovered something about his financial dealings. He said she was threatening the family, threatening our reputation and our security. He said that she had agreed to the arrangement that she would remain in the room temporarily while matters were sorted out. That eventually she would leave for Italy as she had originally planned. But you stopped forging letters after 6 months, Miss Marple observed. Why? Eleanor was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Because Cyril told me to stop. He said that Margaret had changed her mind, that she had decided to remain in England, that the letter writing was becoming too risky. He said that he would handle matters from that point forward. And did you not wonder what handling matters meant? Miss Marple asked, though her tone held no judgment, only curiosity. I was afraid to wonder, Eleanor admitted. I was afraid of what the answer might be. I told myself that Cyril would eventually release her, that once his financial situation was resolved, Margaret would be freed. I told myself that she was being protected, not imprisoned. I told myself many things that I did not believe, but needed to believe. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. Eleanor, I must ask you a difficult question. Did you know about Catherine's engagement to James Thornton before it was announced? Eleanor's eyes flew to Miss Marple's face, surprise evident in her expression. No, Catherine told us, after James had already proposed. She seemed happy, though I thought she appeared composed rather than joyful. Why do you ask? Because, Miss Marple said slowly, I am attempting to understand whether the engagement was arranged by Cyril for strategic purposes, or whether it was a genuine romantic attachment that merely coincided with Margaret's death. The timing strikes me as remarkably convenient for someone in your family. Strategic purposes. Eleanor's voice rose slightly. What strategic purposes could possibly be served by Catherine marrying a solicitor from Ashford? That, Miss Marple said, is precisely what I am attempting to determine. Tell me, did Cyril express pleasure at the news of the engagement? Did he seem relieved? Yes, Eleanor said slowly. Yes, he did. I remember being somewhat surprised by it. He seemed almost as though a burden had been lifted. But I assumed it was simply that he was pleased to see Catherine settling down. Or perhaps, Miss Marple suggested quietly, he was pleased because something he had arranged or anticipated had come to fruition. Eleanor, who in your household has access to poison, who would know the layout of the manor well enough to use the secret passage, who would have both the opportunity and the motive to end Margaret's life. Eleanor's face crumpled. You're asking me if I did it. If I poisoned Margaret. No, Miss Marple said gently. I am quite certain you did not. You lack the cruelty required for such an act. But I am asking whether you know who did. Whether you have perhaps pieced together what happened and have been maintaining your silence to protect someone you love. The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor's hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her eyes were fixed on the carpet, on some point beyond the room, beyond the house. Catherine came to me 3 weeks before the wedding, Eleanor said finally, her voice barely a whisper. She asked me about the locked room. She said she had heard sounds from it, had noticed Cyril going in and out. She asked me what was in there. I lied to her. I said it was storage, that it had been locked for years, that she was imagining things. But Catherine did not believe you, Miss Marple said. It was not a question. No. Catherine is far more perceptive than anyone gives her credit for being. She found the key. She opened the door. She found her aunt. Miss Marple's heart beat a quiet rhythm as the final pieces of the puzzle began to align. And what did Catherine do when she discovered Margaret? She was devastated but composed. She closed the door again and came to me. She asked me how long Margaret had been there, how long she had been suffering. I told her the truth, as much of the truth as I could bear to tell. And then Catherine did something extraordinary. She said that Margaret should not have to suffer anymore. That keeping her there was the real crime. That the family's shame and reputation were not worth another person's torment. And then Catherine said she would speak to Cyril. She said she would make him understand that Margaret must be freed, that she would ensure it happened, even if she had to go to the authorities herself. She said she would give her father 1 week to do the right thing, or she would act. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. But Catherine did not go to the authorities. Instead, she married James Thornton. Why do you suppose that happened? Eleanor's eyes finally met Miss Marple's, and in them was a terrible understanding. Because Cyril told her that if she married James, if she secured herself a position outside the family, then he would handle the situation. He would let Margaret go. He promised her. But he did not keep his promise, Miss Marple said softly. No, Eleanor whispered. 3 days before the wedding, Catherine came to me again. She said she had gone to the locked room to bring Margaret fresh water. She said Margaret was dead. Cyril had poisoned her. And Catherine said that her marriage was therefore pointless. That Cyril had used her complicity against her. That she was trapped in a situation from which there was no escape. And yet Catherine married James anyway, Miss Marple noted. She went through the wedding despite knowing her aunt was dead, despite understanding that her father had broken his promise, despite the horror of the situation, because, Eleanor said with terrible clarity, Catherine realized that leaving Cyril's house, creating her own life, was the only thing that could protect her from whatever he might do next, because she understood that remaining here made her complicit in his crimes, because she is a woman of extraordinary pragmatism, and she had learned that family loyalty and family survival are not always the same thing. Miss Marple was quiet for a very long time. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, painting the garden in shades of grey and gold. The manor, so grand and imposing, suddenly seemed merely a prison of elaborate design holding not just a corpse for 3 years, but the secrets that had accumulated around it like dust. Thank you for your honesty, Eleanor, Miss Marple said finally. I believe you have helped me understand what happened here. Not because you have explicitly confessed to anything, but because you have revealed the emotional and psychological truth beneath the facts. The curse that haunted your family was not supernatural, Eleanor. It was human-born, of desperation, maintained by shame, and ended only when someone was finally strong enough to recognize it for what it truly was. Chapter 9. The exposure Inspector Thornbury sat across from Miss Marple in her sitting room on Friday morning, his expression one of patient skepticism. She had requested his presence, claiming to have reached conclusions about the case that required his immediate attention. But as she began to explain her theory that Cyril Ashford was the poisoner, that Catherine had discovered Margaret alive, that a terrible bargain had been struck and broken, she watched his doubt crystallize into something approaching dismissal. "These are extremely serious allegations, Miss Marple," he said carefully, "based upon what appears to be informed speculation rather than evidence. Eleanor Ashford's emotional revelations do not constitute proof. Catherine's supposed knowledge of Margaret's imprisonment, while troubling, does not establish her father's guilt in the murder itself. We have no forensic evidence placing Cyril in possession of poison, no witnesses to the actual poisoning, no motive we can definitively prove in court. We have his behavior," Miss Marple said gently. "We have his relief at Catherine's engagement. We have Eleanor's testimony that he told her to cease the letters, suggesting he took control of Margaret's situation at that precise moment. We have the timeline Margaret's death occurring only months after Catherine's marriage, after Cyril had supposedly agreed to free her. These are not forensic facts, but they are the facts of human nature, and human nature is far more reliable than poison analysis." "Perhaps," Thornbury acknowledged, "but reliability and proof are not synonymous. What I need is something concrete, something that connects Cyril directly to the poisoning." Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, retrieving a sealed envelope. "Then I suggest, Inspector, that you speak with Dr. Hartley regarding his medical practice in the village. I have reason to believe that Cyril Ashford purchased certain medicinal compounds from the doctor approximately 8 months ago, under the pretext of treating Eleanor's alleged nervous condition. Those compounds, when combined with certain other substances, would produce precisely the effects that Dr. Morrison observed in Margaret's body." Thornbury took the envelope, his skepticism beginning to crack. "You've been investigating this yourself?" "I have been asking questions of people who are willing to answer them," Miss Marple corrected. "Dr. Hartley is a man of considerable integrity, but also considerable discretion. However, discretion sometimes yields when one appeals to a doctor's duty to the law and to the protection of the innocent. I have written down the specific conversation I conducted with him, along with the date and his reluctant confirmation that, yes, Cyril did purchase certain compounds, and yes, Eleanor's supposed nervous condition may have been a fabrication designed to provide cover for the purchase." Over the following days, the investigation shifted with dramatic velocity. Dr. Hartley, pressed by Inspector Thornbury and acutely aware of the legal implications of his earlier discretion, provided detailed records of the compounds Cyril had purchased. Toxicologists confirmed that these substances, in particular combinations, would produce the exact poisoning profile observed in Margaret's remains. The servant was questioned again and admitted, under more rigorous interrogation, that she had seen Cyril himself leaving the guest room on one particular evening, carrying a tray that had previously contained food. But it was Eleanor's testimony, ultimately, that proved most damaging. Confronted with the mounting evidence and encouraged by Reverend Blackwell to speak truthfully, she provided a comprehensive account of Cyril's behavior in the months leading up to Margaret's death. She described his discussions with Catherine about the temporary arrangement, his apparent relief when Catherine had agreed to marry James, his cryptic comments about handling matters after the wedding, his strange satisfaction when he had returned from a particular afternoon appointment at the guest room. By the following Wednesday, Cyril Ashford was arrested and charged with murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through Millbrook-in-Thames that reverberated far beyond the village boundaries. The newspapers seized upon the story with predictable enthusiasm. Respectable solicitor's husband, charged in 3-year imprisonment and murder, the headline screamed. Family secrets exposed in Manor House tragedy. The scandal was exquisite in its complexity, offering endless material for analysis and commentary. Miss Marple, oddly, found herself somewhat depleted by the arrest. The intellectual puzzle had been solved. The threads of motivation and psychology had been woven together into a coherent pattern, and yet she felt curiously unsatisfied. The arrest of Cyril, the legal machinery now grinding toward trial, the public exposure of family shame, none of it felt like resolution so much as amplification. It was Catherine who appeared at her door on Thursday afternoon, still dressed in black mourning clothes, her composure as impeccable as ever. She accepted tea and sat with the careful posture of someone accustomed to maintaining appearances even in moments of profound distress. "I wanted to thank you," Catherine said simply, "for uncovering the truth about my father, for revealing what he did to Margaret." "I am not certain that gratitude is appropriate," Miss Marple replied gently. "My investigation has resulted in the exposure of your family's deepest secrets and the incarceration of your father. These are hardly pleasant outcomes, regardless of their legal necessity." "No," Catherine agreed, "but they are honest outcomes, and my family has lived with dishonesty for far too long. My father created an elaborate fiction to protect himself, and my mother maintained it through her complicity. I married a man I barely knew to escape from that fiction. Margaret died imprisoned within it. The truth, whatever its cost, is preferable to that." "And your new marriage?" Miss Marple asked. "How does Mr. Thornton regard the current situation?" "He has been surprisingly gracious," Catherine said. "When he understood that I had married him to escape my father's control rather than from romantic attachment, he was initially angry. But he has come to understand that circumstances in my family were far more complicated than they initially appeared. He has suggested that we might, over time, develop a companionable friendship, if not passionate love. I believe that is the most honest arrangement available to us." Miss Marple studied the young woman across from her. Catherine's composure was not the serene mask it had appeared during the wedding. It was instead the carefully constructed defense of someone who had seen the worst of human nature and had determined to survive it with her integrity intact. "You are remarkably pragmatic," Miss Marple observed. "Most young women would be devastated by such circumstances. Most young women have not grown up in a house where their aunt was imprisoned in a locked room for 3 years while their parents maintained an elaborate fiction." Catherine replied with a faint smile. "I learned pragmatism out of necessity. My father taught me, through his own example, what happens when one prioritizes protection of reputation over protection of truth. I have no intention of following his example." After Catherine had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her sitting room, watching the late afternoon light cast long shadows across her garden. She was thinking about the nature of family secrets, about the ways that shame and fear could corrupt even the strongest bonds. She was thinking about Margaret, whose imprisonment and death had revealed the rot within the Ashford household, who had been both victim and catalyst for eventual truth. But most of all, she was thinking about the untouched sherry glass on Catherine's wedding day. She had assumed it was Eleanor's attempt to poison either Catherine or James, But now she wondered whether it had been something else entirely. Whether Eleanor, in those final days before Margaret's death, had been attempting some final act of protection or mercy that she could not quite bring herself to complete. Some mysteries, Miss Marple reflected, were not solved by the revelation of fact. Some remained mysteries precisely because they involved the unknowable intentions of people confronted with impossible situations. Those mysteries were, in many ways, far more profound than any murder that could be prosecuted in a court of law. The village of Milbrook-on-Thames would recover from this scandal, as villagers always did. New gossip would eventually replace the old. Cyril's trial would become historical fact, suitable for retelling at dinner parties, but stripped of its human tragedy. And Catherine, having married beneath her expectations and above her comfort, would construct a new life from the ruins of the old. Only Miss Marple would remember, with perfect clarity, every detail of how it had all unraveled. She would remember the small gestures, the telling silences, the moments when human nature revealed itself in all its complexity. She would understand, as few others could, that justice and truth were not always the same thing, and that understanding human motivation was far more valuable than condemning human action. The curse, after all, had been human all along. Chapter 10. The village settles. 3 months had passed since Cyril Ashford's arrest, and Milbrook-on-Thames had achieved that peculiar equilibrium that villagers inevitably reach after scandal. The trial had concluded in late September, a quiet conviction, delivered without drama, resulting in a life sentence that satisfied neither the legal establishment's hunger for justice nor the villagers' appetite for spectacle. Cyril had shown no remorse, no visible emotion, merely a studied indifference that suggested he had retreated into some internal realm where consequences could not touch him. The newspapers had moved on to fresher scandals. The trial transcripts, once the subject of avid discussion at tea tables and in drawing rooms, had been filed away in the local library's archives, historical documents waiting for future researchers to unearth them. Life, as it always did, had reasserted itself with its mundane insistence on continuation. Miss Marple sat in her garden on an October afternoon, observing the autumnal decline of her roses. The flowers, which had bloomed with such vigor through the summer, were beginning their slow descent toward dormancy. It was a process she had witnessed countless times, the inevitable return to quiet after the burst of bloom, the necessary decay that preceded renewal. She found it strangely comforting. This reminder that cycles were natural, that endings preceded beginnings, that nothing remained static. She had received a letter from Catherine that morning, forwarded from London. Catherine and James had taken a holiday on the continent, she wrote, and were considering a move away from Millbrook altogether. James had been offered a partnership in a larger firm in Bath, and Catherine thought a fresh start might be beneficial for them both. She wrote with a kind of measured optimism, neither pretending that all was well nor indulging in tragedy. She acknowledged, with remarkable candor, that she and James would likely never love each other as romantic literature promised, but that they had discovered a genuine respect for one another's integrity, and that seemed a worthier foundation for marriage than the passionate deceptions that had characterized her father's relationship with her. Mother. Eleanor had faded somewhat into the background of the village narrative. She had taken to spending much of her time at the manor, overseeing its maintenance with meticulous attention, as though controlling her physical environment might provide some measure of control over the internal landscape that Cyril's arrest had devastated. She had not visited Miss Marple, and Miss Marple had respected this implicit boundary, understanding that some relationships could not survive the intimacy of shared knowledge. The confession Eleanor had made, the emotional truths she had revealed, had created a bond that was almost unbearably painful. It was Reverend Blackwell who brought Miss Marple news that Eleanor had begun the process of divorcing Cyril. It was a decision that shocked the village considerably, was uncommon in their circles, still carried considerable stigma, but it was treated with unusual sympathy given the extraordinary circumstances. Even the most conservative voices in Millbrook admitted that Eleanor had caused. Constable Davies called upon Miss Marple on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-October, ostensibly to bring her news of the trial's conclusion, but actually, she suspected, because he felt in need of her company. He settled himself with tea and seemed to unburden himself of lingering confusion about the case. "I've been thinking about what Dr. Morrison said," Davies began, "about the timing of the poisoning. He was quite certain it occurred within a week or two of Catherine's wedding, wasn't he?" "He was," Miss Marple confirmed. "Late June, he believed. 3 days after Catherine married James, which raises a question that's been troubling me," Davies continued. "If Cyril had already decided to poison Margaret, if that was his intention all along, why did he bother making the bargain with Catherine at all? Why tell her that he would free Margaret if she married? Why not simply do away with her immediately, before Catherine even discovered her presence?" Miss Marple set down her teacup with the care of someone considering a complex philosophical problem. "That, Constable, is the question that has also been troubling me. And I believe the answer reveals something quite important about the nature of human motivation. You see, I suspect that Cyril did intend, when he made the bargain with Catherine, to honor it. He believed, perhaps convinced himself, that he could eventually release Margaret, that the situation could be resolved without murder. But something changed his mind," Davies suggested. "Yes, something changed. Catherine's marriage proceeded as planned. Catherine left the house, began building her independent life, and Cyril was left alone with Margaret, left alone with his prisoner, left alone with the secret that he had maintained for 3 years. I believe, Constable, that proximity to crime can wear away at one's moral resistance. That living with a terrible secret, day after day, month after month, can erode the psychological barriers that ordinarily prevent us from committing unspeakable acts. You're suggesting that Cyril murdered Margaret not because he had planned it, but because he finally became desperate enough to do so." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that sometimes crime is not a deliberate choice made in a moment of clarity. Sometimes it is the inevitable result of incremental moral compromise, the final step in a descent that began years earlier. Cyril's original act imprisoning Margaret was already monstrous. The lie to Eleanor, the forged letters, the continued confinement, these were layers of deception and moral compromise. By the time Catherine had left the house, Cyril may have felt that murder was merely the final, almost merciful conclusion to the nightmare he had created." Davies was quiet for a long moment. "That's rather depressing, Miss Marple. It suggests that once we begin down the path of serious wrongdoing, we inevitably end up at murder." "Not inevitably," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Many people commit wrongs and find ways to rectify them, ways to escape the spiral of deception and violence. But for those without the capacity for remorse, without the strength to admit their mistakes and seek forgiveness, yes, the spiral often does become inevitable. It becomes a kind of curse, doesn't it? Not supernatural, but psychological. the curse of being trapped by one's own actions. By November, the village had largely returned to its former rhythms. New scandals had emerged, minor ones, the usual substance of village life. Mrs. Henderson's daughter had eloped with a young man from London, much to her mother's shock. The Ashraj railway station had been upgraded with modern lighting, causing considerable debate about the balance between progress and tradition. Reverend Blackwell had decided to implement new hymns in the Sunday service, a decision that would no doubt occupy discussion until Christmas. Miss Marple found herself returning, with renewed appreciation, to the simple pleasures of village life. She tended her garden as the season turned toward winter. She received visits from her various village acquaintances. She attended church services and village gatherings. She observed, with her characteristic attention to detail, the small dramas that comprise the substance of ordinary human existence. On a grey afternoon in late November, as the first frost was beginning to touch the grass, Miss Marple sat in her drawing room with her knitting. She was working on a sweater in a soft grey wool, a project that required no concentration, allowing her mind to wander freely. She found herself thinking, as she often did, about the nature of the mystery she had solved. Margaret Ashford's death had been a murder, certainly. Cyril's guilt was legally established and justly punished. But the truth beneath the facts was far more complex, a tragedy born of family dysfunction, of shame and fear and the terrible human capacity to rationalize the irrational. The curse that the village had whispered about. The curse that Eleanor's mother had supposedly placed upon her children, that curse had been entirely human, entirely the product of psychological damage passed from generation to generation. What struck Miss Marple most forcefully, as she knitted her even rows, was the recognition that understanding human nature did not absolve one of the obligation to pursue justice. She had uncovered the truth, not because it would set anyone free, but because truth itself was valuable. Because lying about what had happened, maintaining the comfortable fiction that Margaret had simply run away to Italy, would have been a betrayal of the dead woman's memory. Yet understanding that truth, living with that understanding, required accepting the pain it contained. It required recognizing that Catherine would forever carry the knowledge of her father's capacity for evil. It required acknowledging that Eleanor would spend the rest of her life wondering if she could have done something to prevent Margaret's death. It required accepting that some wounds could never be fully healed, only eventually accepted as part of the landscape of one's life. As darkness fell over Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and gazed out at the village settling into evening. The lights in cottage windows flickered on, small flames of warmth and normalcy in the gathering dark. The church bell tolled the hour, a familiar sound that had marked time in this village for centuries, through murders and scandals and heartbreaks and healing. She was very old now, and she knew that she would not live to see many more seasons change. But she found herself at peace with that knowledge, having learned long ago that accepting mortality was the truest form of wisdom. Life continued, villages endured, secrets were revealed and absorbed into the collective memory of a community. And for those with eyes to see and hearts to understand, there was always more to observe about the infinite complexity of human nature. The curse had been broken, if not resolved. Justice had been served, if not satisfied. And Millbrook-on-Thames returned, as it always did, to its ordinary existence, carrying within it the extraordinary knowledge of what darkness could flourish beneath the surface of respectability. End.